My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Today, I'm excited to welcome to the podcast IRC Geospatial and Data Analysis Cell, or GDAC Manager at FEMA, Heather Milton. I met Heather about maybe 3 years ago at a conference on the East Coast, and I was very excited to meet her because her skill set is so completely different from the work that I do, but we both work in disaster, and she has this huge wealth of experience as a geospatial and data analyst that I wanted to bring her to the podcast so she can talk about her work, particularly in wind and rain events. You know, it's so important to bring the amazing power of data to help communities better recover after a disaster. And we are talking about a variety of data points from landscape and hydrology, weather, logistical, transportation, and more. It's a very specific, really critically important skill set. It's one thing to have an idea or to say somebody should do something. It's a completely other thing to actually be that somebody who has to pull it off. Heather is that somebody, and I'm really excited to have her on today. It should be a fascinating discussion. If you want to know more about Heather, please check out our description or head directly to FEMA's website at www.fema.gov. Thank you for joining us today, and let's get into it. Okay, so Heather, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here. I've been watching all the amazing stuff you've been doing, and it's really impressive.
Oh, well, thank you. That's really kind. I was excited today because one of the things I said in the intro is like, you have this very specific skill set. It is one of those things where people will say somebody should do something or something should be executed. And it turns out that you are that someone who does that something that really makes a lot of other work entirely possible. So I want you to get into that in just a moment. But what I would really like to start with is, how did you even get into the field of disaster?
Well, that's always an interesting question. And unlike a lot of folks who work for FEMA and other disaster groups, I am not a disaster survivor. I actually came to it a completely different way. I started learning GIS in college and had a GIS career, geospatial mapping work and analysis. And I got involved with a volunteer group called GIS Corps. And what GIS Corps does is supply GIS professionals, people that work in the field, to work with low capacity groups or sometimes international humanitarian work or disaster response work, and collaborate with groups like FEMA and the UN to provide some much needed technical skills when they are really needed. So we do a lot of disaster work to analyze all that location information that happens during disasters, not just where the disaster is, but where are the responders and how do we get from A to B. So there's lots of geospatial work that goes on in disasters, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware. And I was lucky enough to get sent to Indonesia for the Indian Ocean tsunami to help work with the World Food Program and the UN over there in the longer term response. So we took their GIS database of all their response activities and cleaned it up and cataloged it and created a product that would help them analyze that response and think about how could they make it better. Because that was a huge, huge event, as you hopefully remember. And then right after that, Katrina happened. So I moved companies from Esri, the GIS software company, to URS, which was the technical assistance contractor for FEMA. And I went and worked Katrina for 3 years down on the Gulf Coast, mostly doing GIS work for historic preservation, which was super interesting in New Orleans.
Yeah.
And yeah. And so after that, I just stuck with it. I became part of the Digital Humanitarian Network, which is a lot of online and remotely working technical professional groups, everything from Translators Without Borders and Statisticians Without Borders to GIS groups to web scraping groups to anything that can help do intelligence gathering and information dissemination. So that was really, really interesting. And I finally was inspired to go back to school, and I went back to Tulane in New Orleans and got a second master's degree, this time in disaster resilience leadership, because I was really interested in getting further into how to help communities recover better and be more resilient afterwards from disasters. So that's kind of how I wound up here. Now I work for FEMA's Interagency Recovery Coordination Group. We come in with FEMA during the recovery phase, which is not right after the disaster, that's response, but a little bit later. And we work with the communities in the state to think through recovery planning, and we try to find all those gaps in the disaster funding and plug them with other federal and philanthropic resources. So a lot goes on there, and my job is to help manage the group that helps make maps and do data analysis as we think through those problems. So
that's a big job.
That's a lot. It's pretty specific, but yeah, I'm hoping to keep growing within FEMA.
I love that. So can you, I mean, there's so many ways that we can, so can you actually, how about this? Take us through when you arrive on the ground in let's start with wind and rain, and like after Irma, for example, and you arrive in phase 2 recovery. And so how does it start? Who do you start interfacing with? And I know that's probably changed under COVID to some extent, but take us through, what does that look like? Because some of our audience is going to know exactly what you're talking about, and some of our audience is going to be brand new to disaster, and they're looking, and they don't even know that you exist in the way that you do and perform this really critically important function.
Right. So when responders arrive at a disaster, they're not only just responding, they're also gathering information and sharing it with each other so that everyone has better awareness of the entire situation. So if you think about firefighters, they're constantly sharing information on which way is the fire going, the wind has changed. It's just intelligence. And so we try to capture that as best we can and understand what were conditions like before in this community, before the disaster, and in all aspects, in housing, in economics, in demography, or characteristics of the people in the community. What was their healthcare and education system like? We really trying to understand the community and what it was like before this disaster just decimated so many things. Then we look at the impacts of the disaster. What did that disaster, the hurricane, what did it take out? What did it destroy? What parts of the infrastructure are now gone? Are roads and bridges gone? Are hospitals damaged? There's lots of different ways to look at that. So that impacts all those systems that help people, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to think through not only what buildings are damaged, but what does that mean for whatever social assistance was in that building. So every public building is going to affect the community around it because that building is no longer able to support the community the way it did before. So one of the things that responders do when they come in is stabilize that situation. They make sure that healthcare is available if the current healthcare system is, damaged. They try and find ways to get kids back into schools as quickly as possible. They make sure that people in nursing homes that are damaged are moved to nursing homes that are not damaged, so on and so forth. So they stabilize that situation as part of response phase. Our job in recovery is to try and return that community back to prior conditions, or hopefully even better. When things are damaged, that's a sign that they maybe could have been built better. We all know that the climate's changing, storms are getting bigger, sea levels rising. So we're going to have to build differently than we did before. So a lot of our recovery dollars, a lot of our recovery thinking is around creating a more resilient community. Sometimes that might even entail moving the community if they are really in the path of danger. But we work with the state and we work with that community to really think through those problems, involve the community in making decisions and understanding what they want, and then moving forward with what money we can find to help make it happen.
I think one of the
So-
biggest struggles for people who experience a disaster is it's a trauma response. You are also dealing with communities that are heavily in trauma, and you are measuring both their soft and hard infrastructure and trying to figure out a way to get them back. But one of the things that's hard for people to understand because they are traumatized is FEMA is not there though to make you whole. Like that's not actually their function, but they're there to carry and support, and the policies and a lot of the systems are actually made to to serve over 300 million people in the event of. And so that can be very different in wind and rain than it is in wildfire. It can be very different in an urban area rather than a suburban area, which is different from a rural area, which is different from a frontier area. So if you could tell us a story or elaborate on how some of that, like you feel this major issue and at the same time have to contend with the fact that there are limits to what the federal government can do and how much of that has to come from the community.
Absolutely. Right now we're working on Hurricane Ida down in Louisiana. And there are 4 Native American tribal groups there that are not federally recognized. So that complicates our relationship with them. They are state recognized by the state of Louisiana, however. So they actually, things get complicated because like every parish and community in Louisiana, they also have to run all of their disaster assistance through the state. So they're really clients of the state, and the state is our main client at FEMA. So it's very complicated to think through this because at least one of the tribes is already working on relocation because their whole island is just sinking. It's lost 90% of its landmass over the last, 30 years. And there just won't be an island soon. And so they've been working with the state somewhat contentiously, because it's hard to come to agreement on these really important things about how to keep your community together, even though the entire community is moving. And so trying to work with this group through the state, when maybe the state and that group doesn't have the best relationship, that's really hard. And it's hard to know. I'm not in the role of trying to make these things happen. We have tribal advisors, and our leadership works with the state and the tribes to try and help broker agreements around these things. But at the same time, it's the state and the tribe that have to come to those agreements. And all we can do is make suggestions and recommendations and try and do our best to make sure they're aware of all the resources that are available and to make sure that their entire community is considered. And so that speaks to one of FEMA's really strong guiding principles right now is from President Biden's recent executive order, our executive directive on equity and how all federal money must be spent with a lens on equitable resource allocation. So we're doing a lot within FEMA to recognize where our systems historically have been very inequitable. A lot of systems are written that way, not obviously, but it's there. And so FEMA is doing a lot to rectify where our systems for both individual assistance and public assistance have historically not been done equitably. They're not written equitably, and trying to explore where we can change those programs to correct those things. So those are kind of 2 examples where we have a lot of thinking to do and a lot of working with the community and understanding the community better. And for the work that I do with the data, trying to paint those pictures of what things could be, what things were, what happened. We use that data also to help understand what communities have historically been marginalized and make sure that our entire team is aware of that so that they can take that into consideration. Understanding what the obstacles are for different vulnerable communities so that we can design recovery programs for those. So that's part of returning a community, not just back to where it was, but hopefully a little bit better. Hopefully, it's hard to say. But that's always our goal. And right now with equity in mind, it's become very, very pronounced, the emphasis on equity within FEMA. All the groups are really taking a hard look and really trying to re-examine and redesign as much as possible how our federal dollars are spent.
Sorry about that. I think that one of the things that, we're witnessing, and we've been an organization for 4 years and 3 months, and I forgot how many days, but so that's a relatively short period of time. I recognize that, but a long period in disaster for this seat. Doing equity is really what FEMA is diving into, is like, how do you actually do it, and where are the systemic barriers to access? And so we are very pleased to see that emphasis from the Biden administration and in the USDA as well, which is a natural partner to FEMA, especially for rural communities. And so we definitely commented on the RFI that was on the Federal Register on FEMA and equity. We think there are amazing opportunities there to really lean all the way in and commend that work. And I love the fact that you're pulling the numbers and like looking at how that happens. And I'm hoping that it allows for people throughout FEMA to have like a certain measure of creativity. With obviously you always have to keep fraud in mind, but there's a lot of people with amazing brains who work at FEMA, who do understand the communities in front of them, and they're more hampered by the systemic rules or guidelines that are usually put in because of fraud. It's not. So anyway,
right. I remember. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I remember when you and I met in Florida, and one of our big issues in Florida, you came down to speak at our housing thing, which was amazing. It was so cool seeing the power team of you and Gladys and was it Melissa from South Florida? Anyway, but I was learning a lot at that time around housing, and housing is such a huge equity issue, and understanding that so many African-American families have what's called heirs property, heirs as in an heir or heiress, only it's heirs as in plural, as many people own this property that's been handed down and is a point of pride within that family. But it's not been documented well in a legal sense. So it's very, very hard to receive money from FEMA if that property is damaged, and who's gonna make the application, and can they prove their actual ownership, because it's actually owned in common with a large group of relatives. That's one of the equity issues that FEMA has done, I think, made a lot of progress in addressing, because they are now accepting several other forms of ownership documentation, things like utility bills over a number of years, ways to say, yes, I am responsible for this property, even though it's owned by a group of us. So, and that's helping to create a little bit easier path for some groups to get the assistance that they really need.
So one of the things we see in wildfire all the time, and I'm sure it has to be the same in any disaster, is not only the issue of ad hoc housing, like they had a lot in Puerto Rico. I think it was like almost half the houses that were damaged, if not half, were maybe not on the books, not permitted, not, so it's a hard thing to document. We're seeing that in a lot of rural communities, and we're also seeing that multi-generational homes that have been handed down that don't have insurance. And with the California Fair Plan, just in California, we see a lot of people who are non-itinerant residents, who are in very rural areas, who cannot afford the premiums, and they can be getting by, because it's naturally occurring affordable housing in the rural communities, on $25,000 a year. Disaster rolls through, there's nothing left to muck. There's nothing left. And all of a sudden it's exposing these chasms of inequity and poverty. And so can you talk about your experience, or how you see that play out as a similar thing for both wind, rain, and wildfire? Because they're not totally similar disasters in every way.
Right. And You know what, a really good example of the opposite of this is probably going to be this Denver wildfire that just happened, which rolled through some probably fairly affluent new suburbs.
Yeah.
Those people will have plenty of insurance. There is a federally declared disaster for the area, but I guarantee you, we're not going to be spending quite as much money there because those folks have the money already, and they're well insured, and they've got the resources. A lot of folks that we deal with in the rural areas, rural Louisiana is another good example. Rural Kansas, where I live, is another good example. Those resources don't exist in the same way. So it is a big challenge. And in really rural areas, there's really not other available housing, even if it's affordable.
Right.
In fact, there's a lot of abandoned houses, but they're so old you couldn't use them. It's interesting in rural areas, and I'm from Kansas. I grew up here. I moved away for 30 years. Now I'm back, and I'm starting to get really interested in issues around rural areas and how they have a different setting when it comes to disasters. The resources are already very scarce. I think about healthcare a lot. The fact that there's so few hospitals in rural counties, and so they're already in a very resource scarce environment. A disaster rolls through and it's just all gone. And that's the setting for a lot of out migration, and you lose your tax base and your county becomes insolvent. So a lot of what FEMA has to think about is how do we keep, I hate to say taxpayers, but how do we keep residents where they are if we can?
And then how do you begin to rebuild too? Like actually in Kansas, you have, I believe it's Greensboro, which was decimated in like 2007 in a tornado. And then actually the people, three of the leaders from the Dixie fire in Plumas County in Greenville traveled to Greensboro to actually meet them to figure out how do you rebuild a super rural area. And they were, and you know, in a relatively short period of time in a very green manner. So one of the other thing that we see a lot in rural communities is Plumas County, where the Dixie fire happened, that's 15,000 people total in the county. Sonoma County, where I reside, is 500,000 people. Tax base is totally different. I'm actually taking a delegation of fire survivors from here to Boulder County in 3 weeks in order to do that sort of peer-to-peer coaching on how to organize your community. And these were all people who were who had insurance, but underinsurance is rampant, and you know how to organize your community after disaster. One was a renter, so we're bringing them. That's a little easier one. It's not the same group that I would actually bring to say Greenville or have brought to Greenville, because they have super talented people in Greenville. There's just not a lot of people. And then they're looking at, you know, how do you rebuild a town and get people to reinvest here, and who's going to be first out the gate? And, you know, that it has to be something that you're looking at. Do you have any, like, what are the best practices? Because we're watching them with the chicken and egg discussion of, do we, like, at what level, if we rebuild a business, who's going to go to the business? So we need to build the houses, but then the houses are going to want businesses. The good example, and then I want you to ask, sorry, I'm talking too long, but I just get very excited because you're like a wealth of knowledge. And I just want to just want it all. But one of the things we saw we work in Central Oregon and Santiam Canyon, and that for that fire, and the Detroit Lake did this really interesting thing. They had volunteers who built this community center out of an old high school. And I was talking to like the mayor and some of the people in this little town, and they're incorporated, which is a whole different thing. And they said that just having that visual deliverable of hope and progress and like a resiliency center, like also gave them momentum, and they had a town. So can you just address, like, in a rural area that's decimated by a disaster, like, where do you chicken egg first? How do you balance that out? Very long question. I apologize.
Yeah, no, and that I don't know that I really have the answer, but I do have some observations.
I love that. I'll take them.
So going back to Greensburg, Kansas, I wasn't with FEMA at that time, and I wasn't living in Kansas at the time, but I have heard a lot about it. It's definitely one of the case studies for rebuilding in a green manner. and trying to become a more sustainable community in the long run. And that's amazing. I love that it happened in Kansas. And now when you drive to Kansas, there's wind farms everywhere, and that's a really cool development. What the bad thing I heard about Greensburg, I should say the negative thing, the problem that I heard out of Greensburg is that almost all the older folks, retired seniors, wound up moving away.
Yeah.
And the challenge there is that the community made some decisions, and I do believe that the community worked as a community and made these community decisions. I don't think it was just the town government saying this is what we're going to do. And but I do think that they went through a very extensive planning process after the tornado and thought through very carefully what they wanted to do. Now, my advice to small cities, counties all over the country would be, have your comprehensive master plan always at hand. Incorporate your disaster plan into it. The things you want in your master plan, you will have the money for if a disaster hits your city, your town. So you may as well have that ready to go with your big list of things that you want to improve your community. Because if a disaster does hit your community, that's a great time to get it done. But you don't want to have to write that plan after the disaster. You don't want to have to drum up your list of things that you want. You're going to have your list of things that were hurt by the tornado or the storm, but you should also have at the ready that list of the direction your community wants to go well before that disaster hits. So having a community plan. Go ahead.
That's really great advice, but hey, how do you do? So here's the thing. How do you do that though? That's what people are asking. Like, I may know but I had to go to graduate school, and you went to graduate school. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you do that? Where do they find the money to do it? And I always say, have it come a community-led and designed recovery is the best. And be very wary of people from outside of your community, like coming in and trying to lead and design your community. Like we like to be backup go-go dancers for leadership, as opposed to trying to, be saviors or whatever, because it's bullshit anyway, pardon my language. But how do they access those funds? It's a very expensive thing to hire a consultant to do your master plan in advance. Like, how do they even do that? That's what I can just see somebody wondering, like, how does one even begin to do that?
So I remember looking back at Katrina, and then I'm not sure when that started, but it was starting to be enforced after Katrina that every parish in Louisiana needed to submit a disaster plan as well as a comprehensive master plan. And those were made, I don't know, maybe every 5 years or maybe every 10 years, not that often, but they did have to be made. And it was funny because there'd be like 2 or 3 parishes in a row on the map, and they'd all have had the same consultant, and the plan would read almost exactly word for word the same, which makes it more affordable as a way to do it. And there are a lot of commonalities. And as long as that consultant understands your uniqueness to your community, then that's probably an okay way to go. So sometimes that can work. Working with a regional planning group or a council of governments, which is a group of counties, that's another way that it could really be done, and they should have planning expertise. So those are two approaches that could be used. But it is true, it does take a city and a county of a certain size to do that movement forward on plans. Yeah. And I think that's the hard part, and part of it is the state really needs to encourage it and enable it. Not just say this has to happen, but also say we're going to help fund that. So
Fannie Mae provides mortgage options for you and your family. If you have a mortgage owned by Fannie Mae, you may have financial options available after a disaster, such as forbearance plans, deferral of payments, lending assistance, and counseling. Find out more from our Disaster Response Network. Go online at www.knowyouroptions.com/relief. or call 1-877-833-1746 today.
Yeah, right.
It is an equity opportunity when people are like, how do you, I love equity, and you're like, well, how are you doing it though? And one way to do it is to fund these sorts of things. Because one of the things that we see too is after a disaster, we see FEMA just in 2020 had to, I'm going to just, you guys responded to over $20 billion over disasters, according to NOAA.
Mhm.
I
just saw that map today.
Did you notice anything about that map from 2020? They counted all of our wildfires, the worst season on record. NOAA did, not FEMA, as one.
Oh.
Across California, Oregon, and Washington, $16.4 billion just for our wildfires just in 2020. And that's one of the things that we're trying to highlight is how do we partner, how do we help move that across the line in this way that allows FEMA to actually be able to count instead of like the NOAA saying it's one. Well, if you ask all the FEMA people assigned, can't feel like one because it was across 3 states and it was horrific. And I just think there's a learning curve in wildfire.
I think there's after the Oregon fires that I worked last year and the year before, 2020, that you're referring to, they had grouped the 10 largest fires into one single federal disaster declaration, even though they were all over the state. I think they're rethinking that approach.
We're actually actively asking them to rethink it. We would like pre-declarations for FEMA to make it much easier for them. It should not be. And we believe and we know that all of the markers exist for this, because what ends up happening is that you have really small communities like in Lake County, which has been just 70% burned, poorest county in the state of California. Really smart, great local leadership, but they're not magical. I mean, they need help. And the Cache Fire happened last summer, and it was 56 homes, I think 80 homes total burned in a very short period of time. But we were under red flag warning, and it was during the Dixie fire. Like it's all fire weather. So we're actually trying to partner in that sense of saying, how can we support a change in the system? So we have pre-declarations of wildfire, conditions so that you can wrap in, because then it was just very difficult for a really tiny town to even try to begin to recover it, despite the talent and the leadership and the experience that they had, because we don't declare, we don't do any pre-declarations for wildfire like they do for wind and rain events. So they get counted differently.
Right. Yeah. We're able to even stage all kinds of resources ahead of time.
Yeah.
When we do that.
And it's not because people don't care. It's because we're just brand new in the era of mega fires. So we have to just change the system, because we have at least a decade ahead of us of a very rough time. The Dixie Fire was not federally declared until it was 750,000 acres. And choking smoke. And it's not because people did not care. People cared. It's a matter of how this, it's a systemic change that can be changed, and it's another opportunity for equity. So that's my soapbox, and I have dismounted now.
I like it.
Can you tell us, like what's one of the most surprising things that's happened in your service when you go into a disaster place and you're looking around? Like what I always love the concept of emergent leadership, of people you don't expect, like this woman Vera, who owned the community bookstore in New Orleans. So she is famous. You probably know Vera. We've all probably met Vera. That was like, she was the hub of resiliency and communication and, why, and sort of moving forward. So what has surprised you the most about how disasters are, how communities recover?
Well, I'll tell you that the pandemic really brought this out. But if it wasn't for earlier disasters, like even the New York City electrical outage, but people are so adaptable they're so good at adapting tools. And so we've known for years, everyone talks about the DC Moms Facebook group as being one of the early mutual aid type of groups, because they would just share information and then they would start sharing resources, and you could ask, see if someone had something you need, or you could offer something if you didn't need it. So from that idea, which happened all over the country, of course, came lots of neighborhood groups And even Nextdoor, which is basically hyper-local social media. It's just based in your geographical neighborhood. And then the pandemic hit, right? So mutual aid just went off just into outer space. It just blew up. And I made a point of watching it because it's a phenomenon that I absolutely want to study somehow, right? This whole idea that you are your own first responder, you're your neighbor's first responder.
Yes.
You are their resource and they are yours. And we should be leveraging all the tools available to do that. And it's even now that the pandemic has died down a little bit, people can get out and get what they need and jobs have started to come back. You still see these asks for help and offers of help. And I don't think it's going to go away. I mean, as long as we have people that are making so little money, this is a great way to help support them. Now, should it be the only way? Absolutely not. We definitely need to fix our systems and start having more equitable socioeconomic conditions. But in the meantime, the mutual aid systems that have just blossomed on Facebook and Nextdoor and lots of Reddit, probably lots of other platforms, in libraries having social workers now setting up clinics to repair appliances. I mean, there's just so many really creative things that are going on. Even things in Kansas, one of my favorites is Shop Kansas Farms, which grew up as a way, we knew the pandemic was starting to sort of endanger those large meat packing processing plants. If a COVID case was at a meat packing plant, the whole plant had to shut down. Thousands of cows could not be processed, or pigs. And those workers were out for a couple of weeks, and it really decimated the meat supply in some parts of the country. And I'm from meat packing country, so this really hit me. But this guy here in Kansas set up a Facebook group for starters so that people could buy directly from ranchers. And the rancher would work with a small processing plant to get that cow processed and to the consumer. They started setting up ways that you could go visit the farms. You could buy all kinds of products from these farmers. So it's just another more advanced mutual aid system that is the backup. It's kind of funny because it's the more traditional system, really, right? Our food supply used to be more local or regional, and now we don't even know where our food's from. It's a way of drawing it back to the traditional system, because our current system of just-in-time supply and demand and the very fragile logistics of giant corporations is very fragile. I mean, it's just prone to breakdowns when we have these large disasters. So I'm looking around at these examples of how we can do local and regional support for each other in lots of different ways, whether it's just making sure you buy local when you go buy a gift, to trying to buy local produce, to instead of throwing something away that you no longer need, finding someone on Facebook who can use it. So to me, that's the outgrowth of the surprising thing, not surprising, but kind of surprising at how much it took over our activity in some platforms. And to me, it's just phenomenal. And we should do more to encourage that. And I really been trying to figure out a way to ask FEMA to incorporate it into our community preparedness curriculums.
I love that idea because that's our entire business model, for the record. Like, people are like, what do you do? And I'm like, well, we help people navigate after a disaster. And then we also have a whole other before the fire program, but my sweet spot is after the fire and specific to wildfire, because there isn't nearly as much experience as there is in wind and rain. I don't know about wind and rain except for what I learned from, you people at conferences, but that sweet spot, I live for that though, that human to human connected web, that tissue of humanity. And one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking is I thought, we often only hear about how our social media and our social fabric is being torn apart and how divided we are. And I'm always like, well, yeah, I see that on TV. I don't experience that though. And maybe I'm super privileged and really lucky, and I will acknowledge all of those things. But I see people leaning into they're aggro right now. Don't get me wrong, because we're all really tired. And, you know, next door can be wonderful. My next door in Sonoma is used to terrorize people. So that's a little different. But generally speaking, especially on the onset of the pandemic, that community fabric, though, of helping each other, of seeing a problem and finding the gap and being like, that's what I'm going to do, because that's why I work in this business. Is that's what happened here. Is we were cut off from the county because of how our geography is in Sonoma Valley. We were surrounded by fires. And the county I worked for the county, but I was one of 2 employees out here for like 10 days. And it was really scary, but people were really gorgeous, like amazing, so generous and so creative. So I would love it if you would study that. I would take that class. I would give you any information we have from any of our 9 fire affected communities, because that's why we go in as humans, even during COVID, so they can meet, they have to vibe you out and make sure that and you've got to meet as human beings. And I think that would be great if you would do that work. And if I could support you in doing that work in any way, I would loan everything and every person and every resource, because it also amplifies what's really beautiful about being alive and being in the space of disaster. It's what Rebecca Solnit calls a paradise built in hell.
Oh, my favorite. She's my favorite.
Oh, she's so good. I just read this whole other essay by her. It's political, so I won't mention it, but I might send it to you. That was really helpful to me. But that would be, sort of that model of how do you pay it forward? That's what we started looking at right away, like as a community, because it's not what that's not what FEMA does. Like, that's not, do you know what I mean? Like, they are supposed to come in and help you and build the structures in the system. The community actually has to carry itself across the line. So
sometimes that frustrates me a little bit, because, well, first of all, FEMA's stretched very thin right now.
Yeah.
And I think people think, well, the feds have everything and they have so much money and they have so many people and they, they're they have endless resources, and it can look that way, but it's definitely not true. And with the pandemic and a record number of disasters ongoing right now, we are stretched extremely thin, and it is definitely taking its toll on the system. And we've got even a lot of folks leaving FEMA just because they're stressed out as far as they can go. So, it's happening everywhere, including in FEMA. But and that's why this person-to-person, community, this whole idea of mutual aid is so important. That's why I joined GIS Corps. That's why, and volunteer for so many things all the time. That's why I joined the Digital Humanitarian Network, to offer the skills that I have to whatever was going on. And I just joined a network today called, I think FEMA helps run it and set it up, but there were 240 people on the call today. It's called the Resilient Nation Partner Network. And it's people working in all kinds of climate adaptation and resilience space. And I was like, this is a lot of people. Can we start getting like working groups that are on different topics? Because this is starting to be too big and to do as just one big group. But it was just amazing. And that's the sort of networking that we need to do, that we can lend each other our proficiency and our expertise and benefit from theirs. That's how the work happens. Nobody can know it and do it all, not even FEMA. So, yeah.
Well, that's a good message for everybody, though, is because that's so. I think Cherry, I wanted to be on that call today, and I'd love to be in a working subgroup too, because it's very big. When it's very big, then I don't. Anyway, but I love that work, and I'm super interested in it. And Cherry is Jokum, who was on the previous podcast. If you saw her, we all know her.
Yeah.
Who got us involved. But that's exactly what that web is, what I would love to see tightened. I'd love to participate in it. Doesn't mean you take out what's creative or organic about it, but to really highlight it, because we see a lack of more people coming into the space of disaster, which we need, because none of us are doing any of this alone, period. our organization, really, we just bring people who know stuff. Like, let's be honest here. It's not because we know everything. We're just like, oh, you have that. Oh, is that what you want right now? Like, meet the, you get a person and you get another person and here's a resource that we heard of. But that's really the extent of the after the fire, the model. But what we're seeing is we do run into people who were like, I know it all. I know exactly how to do all of this. And I am going to be the hero of this community. And they're like, they Heisman because and I just had this happen in an email. This guy wrote me, he's like, I looked at your website. I know everything that you know and all the people that you know, all the resources. And I was like, wow, because I've never met anybody who knew everything there is to know about disaster. I just said, sounds good. Like I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna force myself on you. But really, I mean, look at how diverse your talents are from my talents. And it takes like a lot of people to do this work, that whole ecosystem of people.
It really does. And trying to find, and the group within FEMA that I work with, we're trying to find what's the problem, who's affected, who's got the money to fix it, and who can do the work. Like, it's just a whole process. And then what does the community want to do about it? And it takes a lot of different players and a lot of balancing balls. But I kind of feel like it's not really my job at FEMA, but it is something that I really love to do the most. Is just connecting dots and just making sure people are aware of each other and that those resources are there. I'll help you find them. To me, that's a dream job. So you've got
well, you should dream yourself right into that perfect job, because then I want to sit next to you all day long, because we're just trying to demystify it. And also we like to, share our lessons federally. We really don't do any state advocacy work at all, but we do federal. And we want to be a partner and a resource for like, what are you really hearing? And it's okay if the system isn't perfect, as long as we are moving towards making it more perfect and progress all the time, and not being defensive and not being possessive. Because I think that as we get more stressed because of COVID, after 2 years, we're seeing a little bit more of an air of possession in areas that I have concerns about.
Yeah, I think there's a whole lot of uncertainty, that's contributing to that. I think thinking about what the resource is that is most in need, and this is especially in rural areas, I think, and by marginalized communities. We always kind of call those low capacity communities, right? There's just not enough people, so they're not going to have a planner. They're not going to have a grant writer. Those are the two skills that are probably most in need. And if I could just set up a college right now and shovel people through it to learn those skills, those are probably the grant writing, especially in grant administration. That is a huge, huge, huge skill. And I'm hoping that we rewrite some of our rules so that we can open that up a bit more for consultants to assist with. It has happened a little bit, but by allowing them to earn part of the grant itself, that's part of how that'll work. So for the public assistance, that has happened a little bit. There's a new category, and it goes to those administrative costs when you have to hire someone to help you.
I'm also really excited that FEMA has a beta test right now for communities to be able to do more. We've been asking for a TurboTax model, like for all the federal agency, with a common application and we're not the only ones. SBP has been asking for.
That was my idea.
Oh, well, here's the thing.
A lot of people's idea.
In my brain now, it's Heather's idea that SBP is also supporting. It was funny because I just interviewed Zach Rosenberg from SBP, but even last year when I was talking to Liz McCartney, or 2 years ago, I guess now, and I was like, well, since 2018, we've been asking for this TurboTax model. So this if then, because the language has to be very specific when you do apply for these grants. And if you get it wrong, then even if you will be denied, and you won't know that it was really because of this one line necessarily. They may tell you, they may not. And then if you don't execute it and report it correctly, they will claw back all of those funds. It's just way more likely to happen in a rural underserved low capacity community than it is in a super overall very wealthy community like Sonoma County where I live, and they could hire it all out. And so it's this other disaster economy, which maybe those big consultants don't want to hear this, but I'd love for them to help the federal government to work themselves out of a job in the interest of equity. But that's not going to happen. But through FEMA, like having this this new process that will come online, that's being beta tested now, I am just very excited to see like how that might help lower capacity communities navigate this, in addition to letting them know right away, like count your volunteer hours, because you can use that for your match. People don't know that. I mean, they just, like they don't know.
There's a lot of mystery around it, and there's a lot of, and that goes right back to that equity question. If it's in language people don't understand, they're going to give up. And
they're traumatized to begin with.
Advocating for a single form for a long time for public assistance, and across all the agencies, though, not just FEMA, but also
Same.
HUD. Yeah, it's well, here's a development that I'm guessing you probably know of, but it's
Go ahead, I got it. Maybe not.
At Region 9, so that's your region. The GDAC group there,
we love him,
has been putting on, they've developed kind of an online dashboard that helps grant writers get the correct demographic information requested for their grants, for their grant applications. And it's really funny.
I did not know that. I love that. That's new information to me. So I welcome that.
So it's kind of backwards, though, that HUD already knows where its communities that it considers of interest or in need or whatever. It knows where they are already, but it still wants you to prove that you're in one of those by submitting this demographic information, which it already knows. It's really backwards to me, and could be a step that they remove. It's just like, does this really service a community that we consider important? Yes. I mean, that should be how it works, but they really want you to submit all of this about, we have this many people who are a minority or disabled or over 65 or whatever the group is. And so we are a kind of a special needs community in a sense. So it's odd, but anyway, I should put you in touch with those folks to look at that dashboard and maybe give them some feedback.
I would love that.
A lot of information on it.
I would love that. And we're staffing up now, and I'm only building capacity. Like Kyle's coming on full time in a couple of weeks, and he will be a program associate who's going to, work in these areas. But I'm finally like bringing my head up. The first 2 years, I feel like I was like trying not to drown in all of the information and the learning curve, and the learning curve remains steep, but I'm finally able to bring people on who can, take parts of that. So I would definitely, I actually really like Region 9. It's my region, so it's probably why. I think,
well, you make it look easy.
I do, because yeah, you know why? Because I don't put it on like LinkedIn. Like, I'm having a really bad day with this leader in this other recovery who is an unkind human being. So, I'm not, and then I tag him.
You're just professional.
I just keep it like, I just keep it going. Just got to keep it moving, because what I always think about is who's my end user, who matters. And it has to be the community that we have made a promise to, and we always keep our promises, or that we are helping behind the scenes. One of my big barriers right now is I was so quiet the first 2 years, like helping in certain communities, that I just got a call, or one of my program people did yesterday, from a leader in one of those communities who was like, I've never even seen you in our LTRG. I'm like, why would you be in your LTRG? Because we were helping this other group with all of our resources, because we're not going to jump in front of them and be like, where's my cape? Where's my kudos?
Here we come to rescue you. Yes.
Yeah, like we just aren't going to do that. And I didn't even, it's only in the past, since COVID, I started doing this because I was so afraid that what if we decided not to change into after the fire? And I wanted so many cool people that I'd met. I wanted to memorialize all this coolness. And I'm not even halfway through my list. I'm like a third of the way through my cool list. I'm just starting with my top, 60 in the first 3 years. And then I want to show everybody all of the cool people, but it's such a learning curve. But I feel really fortunate. I can't wait till we get back to a space where we can actually meet together. We are looking at a late spring convening. I will send you the dates that I'm hoping you can be a panel. And it was shut down right before COVID. We were going. I also love like your particular skill set is fascinating to me because it's very logistical.
Well, strangely, I've been trying to get out of GIS for a long time, but I just keep getting drawn back into it. That's where the jobs are, frankly. But I would love to be more of an on-the-ground community organizer, maven, more along your lines.
I love that. Yeah,
maven. Because it's maven. Yes, that's such a cool word. Yes. I always feel like that's where I would really thrive. But data's pretty cool too. I'll take it.
Well, you know what? Well, this is just, we're only a few years into this relationship. Like, I always want to thank Fannie Mae because I feel like Tim Carpenter has been like one of the biggest gifts of my life. Like he's always just throwing me more cool people to meet. And, but I do miss that about conferences that I would go, and I'm almost always the only wildfire person historically. And then I'm always like, there's a lot of really smart people in this space, and I'm not the only one. But thank you for having me. But I would like more opportunities to sit in a room and share lessons and hear from people who are just really smart and doing really great work like you. So we're going to create one of those for the end of late spring in Sonoma, which is terrible. Right. Right. And who wants to come here?
I know it's terrible. I have a friend in Guerneville. I'll see if he'll put me up for that.
Oh my God. Guerneville is where the Russian River is. And one of my favorite places.
He works at it's actually a friend who went to Indonesia with me as part of GIS Corps. He's a former GIS person, and now he's head of marketing at one of the wineries over there. So pretty talented guy.
Well,
we on your team.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to. I would just, also because then I would take advantage of that somehow. I'd be like, would you do some GIS for us on this? Because we're launching a social pinpoint very soon, which will help other communities. Actually, I'd love you should be in the focus group for that. I'm going to talk to Pam because Social Pinpoint is an online planning tool for civic engagement. And we have purchased the platform to the use of the platform, and it needs GIS. Kyle works on it a lot. And but what we're doing is we're mapping the fires and then who's active in those fires and then the direct links to those people, so that as we have more fires or people want to build resiliency, so they can actually look at, say, the Dixie fire or look at the Alameda fire and say, okay, who's active in that space? And then we'll put a lot of people on there. And then I put comments below about what we consider the best practices. That's an opinion, but it's an educated opinion. So even it's just a very, so I would actually love to have your opinion on that, because it's
I'd love to see it. I anything with maps, I'm a big fan.
But it's community organizing using maps though. So it's like right in your sweet spot. So I'm going to set that up. Is there anything that you wish I had asked you today on the podcast, or any subject that I blazed right past because I was so overly excited, because I do get overly excited?
I think the biggest issue that as you and I met through housing in Florida, and we see housing as the issue everywhere. And I had a woman in my photography program in New Orleans that I ran with homeless people for a few years, was invited to hang her photograph to the UN headquarters in Geneva in an exhibit put on by UN Women to highlight homelessness of female. And so we raised some money and traveled to Geneva to be at the opening, which was really cool. And we were I was so impressed that at the UN level, but also discouraged, right? But even at the level of the UN, homelessness is a huge problem worldwide. It's growing all the time, and real estate speculation is a major contributor, as I'm sure most of us know. The market is so inequitable, and it's such a struggle to find ways to fix that. And to me, that is the number one issue, not just in the US, but worldwide, is how can we provide safe, sanitary housing for everyone, so that people don't have to live on the streets or in shelters. And so to me, that's going to continue to be the biggest issue that I always note and look at and think about and pass on articles about, because it's just a huge problem. And for instance, after disasters, renters are really kind of out in the cold in a big sense, because we don't, at FEMA, they're not entitled to the same level of assistance, historically speaking. How do we fix that? That's one of our questions. So
we would actually, and this is an unpopular opinion, just mine, but I would like, you can't drive a car without insurance. You have to have at least liability insurance. I would like all renters to have $5 a month renter's insurance, just something, because it's a very rude awakening, because they assume that they are covered under the homeowner's policy, and they are not. And it's, you can, it's $5 to $10 a month. And I know for some people that's really rough. And if we want to give them back in a tax credit, I'm fine with that. If we're like, oh, $5, $10 back, and fine, no problem. But there's no insurance for them. And it's a very precarious situation. Home is so incredibly fundamental. And I think that really boils down to a lot of the work that you do and that I do, which is like, how do you get people back to a home? You can't give them back the day before. But the other thing is, and I'm super passionate about this, is that I'm trying to get all everyone to really see that 20% of our population in this country lives in 80% of the land mass, where most of the naturally occurring affordable housing already exists. The thing that we are trying to accomplish in more suburban areas and urban areas is being accomplished. Even in the state of California, you can live in Eastern California, $50,000 plot of land, and a dwelling. That's possible, and it did happen in Greenville before their fires. We should be fortifying those existing homes, especially the ones that are substandard housing. I'm not here to protect substandard housing, for the record, but I want to lean into that spot of resiliency, because it's also an opportunity, again, for equity if we help protect naturally occurring affordable housing.
absolutely.
Oh, I took out my soapbox again.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. It's a good one. I think it's kind of funny, because I feel like the pandemic brought a little ray of hope that if enough of us can work remotely, we could actually spread out.
Yeah.
And live in
Amen.
smaller towns and things like that. But then you also, I also have this issue, my personal issue is that urban wildland interface, which is that danger line of fires, and how do we develop more safely in those areas too, even when we are spreading out and becoming more, creating more affordable housing in places where it's possible.
It's true. And, I think that people have to differentiate, though, between, we're not saying, approve a 400 unit subdivision up into the woods. We're not saying that. We're saying that a lot of people already live in the woods. They're super attached to their land. They are good stewards of the land, or they live even in grasslands, whatever we're talking about, to not assume A, that they don't care about the land, or B, that they're not attached to it, and C, that there's nothing that we can do in order to keep them safer. Because I find myself on like public radio having as a guest, having a fundamental argument discussion with somebody who lives, in the Oakland Hills. I'm telling people who live in the WUI that they shouldn't live there. And I'm like, well, first of all, fire doesn't care about your WUI, not that much, just doesn't, like that wasn't even.
I think we learned that this time around. I've been educated on how that works.
Well, in our fires, the fire took the overpass. It was like, I had this vision in my head of it, looked left and right. And it was like, I see an overpass, and it went over a 6-lane freeway. And then it went around and it snaked in and it found an empty lot and it took out 1,400 homes in Coffee Park. Like, it doesn't care. Like, the WUI matters, but mega fires are it's a game of embers. The more embers you have, the further that they carry, and they're like emissaries ahead. So mega fire, if we lean into how to deal with that and how to fortify homes, and we get to a place of balance, mostly through indigenous land practices, then we can withstand some mild fires. Soapbox was out again. For those of you tired of me pulling it out, don't worry. We're at the end of the podcast. It's the third time I've done it today. I can say
where I live in ranch land, it's they've gone back to indigenous land practice, and they fire up the ranch lands about every 3 years. They burn off every pasture. And it's definitely the best way to maintain the health, along with certain changes to how they farm the cattle out, how they manage the cattle.
How they rotate,
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a zero-sum game. It's just like, I'm reading a book by this woman named Kat Anderson, who's out of Davis. And it is called, I'll send it to you. It was just recommended to me, but it was about essentially how it's about the history of California and indigenous land practices. And for thousands of years, we became human interacting with the environment, that there was a positive cyclical relationship with indigenous people, how they managed it. But the idea that somehow they just tiptoed through the woods and did not, don't
touch
manage the land is just, it's hooey. I think it's called tending the middle. Anyway, I just started it. I bought 3 copies for my staff. Anyway, so I'm very happy to hear. I could talk to you all day long. So I'm just
it would be fun.
I would so enjoy this. I'm looking forward to inviting you out here in the late spring to be on a panel and to sit with your friend in Guerneville. I love Guerneville. I got engaged in Guerneville. And just nice. Convening with you again in person. And I really want to thank you for taking this time. And I feel really lucky when I get a FEMA person like Cherry and you on the podcast, because people have to really, I want people to meet the really cool people that I've met. And especially if FEMA can feel impersonal to some people, and you're like, it's actually full of human beings, and check out these super cool ones. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I think it's always a good opportunity for us to try and share the important messages, that the ways that we know the system is flawed and the things we're trying to do to fix it, and the ways that everyone can pitch in. If your community has a disaster, then definitely help with the planning. Definitely help figure out what you want to happen next. Because, if you don't play, you can't win, I guess.
That's right. Hey, that's a perfect note to end on. So I want to thank you again, Heather, for being on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information about Heather, we're going to drop a link in the comments, and you can also visit and look at FEMA.gov and look at more programs that are out there. But, you have a voice, and it matters. And I thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's so good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. Thank you. Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.
Fannie Mae provides mortgage options for you and your family. If you have a mortgage owned by Fannie Mae, you may have financial options available after a disaster, such as forbearance plans, deferral of payments, lending assistance, and counseling. Find out more from our Disaster Response Network. Go online at www.knowyouroptions.com/relief or call 1-877-833-1746 today.